the police department does not object or oppose the recommendations that the task force is making in terms of providing additional services to our community, because we know our community has been underserved for many, many years. I know that for my 23 years of working as a police officer in this town and living here. I do, though, have some opposition to having the police department fund all these services. Richmond is a difficult place to hire police officers because of our history of being a violent city. People don't want to come here. It's been made even more difficult with the talks of layoffs. I actually have about 18 officers that are in various phases of the hiring process with many other police agencies locally. That means that they are not waiting to see if they're going to have a job July 1 or not. They are choosing to leave on their own. So I already know that I'm going to be fighting an uphill battle in the next couple years just to try to get more police officers hired. So that's my main concern, is that we look at not laying off police officers. But to achieve the $10.3 million, there's two things that I would need to do. I would need to lay off 23 police officers, and I would also need to cut several contracts that we've had for many years now. So with that many officers cut, we would have to focus pretty much most of our efforts in having a robust patrol teams. And that's because when you call 911, we want to know that somebody's going to respond to that emergency call. So we'll be focused on emergency calls for service. That means, somebody has a gun, somebody has a knife, somebody's, getting physically hurt, somebody's house is actually being broken into at that moment. Those emergency type calls that we want to get to and hopefully, catch a perpetrator in the moment. Other than that, there's not going to be, we won't have the ability to provide a lot of follow-up and investigation after the fact. Our investigations team will be down to probably about a dozen officers, which means that they would have to focus on the shootings and homicides. We had 2 shootings today, and we've had now 7 homicides this year and close to 40 shootings this year. So the 4 homicide detectives that we have obviously have their hands full. So they'll be focused on the more, pertinent emergency calls and investigations that we need them to focus on. Other than that, the other big unit that we need to focus on in investigations is our domestic and sexual violence unit. Domestic violence is huge. We always want to make sure that we're able to charge a suspect in time so they don't get out of jail and go back and re-abuse the victim. So the other focus is on domestic and sexual violence crimes. Property crimes, we would basically only handle if there was somebody in custody, and that just involves taking the case to the district attorney's office for charging. Other than that, we won't have any other units. And so how this affects patrol is, while we'll still have 9 beat officers across the city at any given time, which we do right now, which is not enough, those officers will have to do more of an investigation on the front end, where now, let's say we respond to some type of investigative issue. There's a battery or any kind of investigative issue. The officers that respond take a preliminary report. Those reports then go to our detective bureau for follow-up. And the detectives are able to do follow-up interviews. They go to the what we call the CIC, the Children's Interview Center, and take children for interviews. Those take hours long. They do, the detectives do more of that the follow-up work that takes a lot longer time to handle. Not having the detectives to do that, patrol officers are going to have to do that on the front end. So that means that there will be longer response times when you call the police. I'll give you another example. Traffic collisions that take a long time to handle. Currently, we have beat officers, if it's a major injury crash, they'll respond to the crash, they'll take the report. They won't take the report. They'll respond to the crash, and then they could call a traffic officer to respond to do more of the reconstruction, do witness interviews, and take their time to reconstruct the crime scene and complete the report. Without a traffic unit, the patrol officer will have to do that. Those investigations take hours to complete. That means that beat officer will be tied up on that investigation for hours and not be able to respond to the other calls for service on their beats. So those are the things that kind of take place behind the scenes right now that allow for beat officers to be in service more, to take more calls in a timely manner. So the response times are huge. Some of the other impacts are we have to reduce our services. We can't continue to respond to all the calls that we currently respond to. Last year, if some of you guys will remember when I came and spoke about our reduction in services because of the reduction in our staffing last year in the budget cuts, we lost 34 positions. We had to reduce some of those services that we responded to. And so that included making mandatory reports online. So if your car is broken into in the middle of the night, then instead of calling us to take a report like we've done my entire career, we now refer you, our dispatch center refers you to go online to make that report online, and you don't have any contact with a police officer. To me, that's not customer service. Most people don't call the police, hardly ever. Maybe once, twice. Most people in our community don't call the police all that much, especially up here in this area. But when they do, when you are victimized, you expect an officer to respond. And having to go to that model where we're saying that we're not responding was really difficult for me. But that's where we are in terms of our staffing, where we just don't have enough people to respond to all the calls that we've previously responded to. So to reduce additional calls for service, because again, they're going to be tied up on these longer, investigations, there's additional calls that we are not going to be responding to if these cuts occur. Those are issues with homelessness issues. If they're not criminal issues, if somebody's not being hurt or injured at the time, we're not going to be responding to those issues. Additionally, calls at schools, unless it's an active shooter, we're not going to be responding for many of the other calls at schools. And I'm sorry, I got to get my list out for the other stuff. Loud noise and music calls, fireworks calls, calls at our local hospital, trespassing calls at abandoned properties, non-criminal disturbances, panhandling and loitering calls, suspicious persons or vehicle calls if it's an anonymous caller and we don't have specific criminal details, drug usage, illegal marijuana grows. So those are some of the things that we're looking at, trying to find alternative responses that don't involve the police department. And some of these can be taken up with the recommendations of the task force once the team gets up and running. But again, that's not up and running right now. So if we have the cuts come July 1, there's going to be a gap in services for people to answer these types of calls. The quality of life issues are also ones that I'm having a difficult time with, and these are drug houses, disorderly conduct, prostitution, again, not necessarily a problem in this area, but in other areas of our city. And these are things that can't be effectively done by police officers when they are responding to calls for service throughout the day. They can't take the time to do the investigation for these longer term problems. A lot of the quality of life issues that we face here in our community take more investigation, take a lot more time to work on to find a resolution. We work with a lot of different community partners as well as other city departments to work on these issues, and the beat officers just don't have the time to do that. But with no other team to facilitate that, those things won't be taken care of. We can't address those issues.